Thank you. So thank you for inviting me today to talk about innovation in the self-service channel. So firstly, just a little bit about what is innovation and how important is innovation. Of course, innovation is what drives growth globally. And of course, why is growth important? That is what brings wealth and well-being to all of us. And we know, of course, that in the last 10 years, growth globally has been a little sluggish, and it's one of the things that all of our politicians are quite focused on. And our industry, of course, still has a long way to go in terms of delivering financial inclusion to all of the 7 billion people that we ought truly to be doing. And I think, that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about in this slide presentation, and in terms of how innovation might help in us to get in that direction. Okay, so the ATM industry has a unique contribution to make to global growth in that sense, because it is self-service and automation of financial transactions that can bring everybody within the fold of the global financial system. And as you know, of course, today financial access is pretty good in the West, but really quite poor across the world. And there are large swathes of the third world that does not have access to financial transactions and doesn't even have access to cash dispensing and ATMs, because ATMs are just still so very expensive for the third world to be able to roll out and so on. So I think, what do we need to do as an industry in order to kind of move in that direction? So a little bit about that in my presentation today. And of course, success in us achieving this will transform really a lot of billions of lives around the world, because quite a lot of what people create today in terms of wealth is held under mattresses in cash and so on, and it is not part of the global financial system. And of course, the more that people can take part in that global financial system, and the more that the savings of individuals around the world is part of the banking system, the better it would be for all of us. So what are the ingredients? What is it that we need to achieve in order to go in that direction? Well, lower cost hardware would be a good starting point, of course, because today, if you look at the cost of ATMs, ATMs in Europe cost 20,000 euro per ATM per year in terms of total cost of ownership. So it's not just a hardware issue, it's hardware, software, and services. And of course, this is a pretty expensive number for Asia to be able to take part in at the same level as Europe and the West does. The good news, of course, is that the cost of hardware is going down. Software, it's becoming more widely available in terms of the quality and the depth of features that people would like to have. And of course, the total cost of ownership of all of the hardware, software, services, and the ATM channel is going down. And that is, of course, very good news. First, a little bit about what the world in 2020 might look like. I was asked to do a presentation on this last year, mid-2014, and this is a slide from that presentation that I did about what 2020 might look like. On a big picture scale, well, 7.7 billion people in the world. GDP would be 40% higher than it was in 2014, so that's really quite a significant change from where we are today. More than half the people living in cities. China becoming bigger than the US, and in fact, on a PPP, purchasing parity basis, China overtook the United States last year in 2014. 6 billion people with mobile telephones, 5 billion people with internet access. And this particular slide was created from a document published on the internet by Telefonica, so they were kind of interested in where smartphones were going to go to. 10 gigahertz processors, 1 terabyte storage on our handheld devices. It's just going to be quite an incredible world in 2020. 50 billion connected devices in the world. Oh, and my forecast for 2020, the last OS2 ATM will be decommissioned finally. ATM trends, something quite amazing today. I don't know whether you guys know that very recently a Windows tablet was introduced by HP. It's called the HP Stream 7, which is a full Windows 8.1 tablet PC with full Windows 8.1 for just $99 US. And we've tested our software on this. We know that we can run our ATM software on this tablet PC. So I think, you know, as these kinds of much lower cost hardware with incredible power, with the ability to run full Windows becomes available, it also means that, you know, the cost of that, you know, that TCO of delivering much better hardware, much better software, much better services to people globally is going to become that much more possible. And of course, not only is the brains of the ATM hardware becoming cheaper, but also the arms and legs, the bits that do the real work, cash deposits, cash recycling, coin handling, check processing, all this kind of hardware, as you know, is getting better, faster, cheaper. It is a very exciting world for us to be in, but also a very exciting place that these transactions could become much more widely available. And that, of course, is a crucial part of financial inclusion globally. And then, of course, all these different hardware types is about more transaction types. To take an example, Chinese ATMs today have 100 plus transaction types on their ATMs, a little different than the situation in the West, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The other thing that I've call here the rising star of transactions is assisted self-service, and I will talk a little bit more about that as well. Now, most Western ATMs do not have a large number of transaction types today. In the UK where I live, there are maybe the usual 6 transactions, balance inquiry, cash dispense, statement print, and so on. And there is a reason why, I think, and even though in that Chinese situation there are 100 transactions, but if you look very closely at the volumes of transactions done outside the big 6 transactions, then the transaction count is not that high. So they have put in quite a lot of investment in making those transaction types available, but people perhaps are not really using it. And of course, one of the reasons for that, my belief anyway, is that self-service is really appropriate only for transactions that are done regularly by a person. So let's say, for example, something that you might do once a month. And it is not really how easy it is to do the transaction or how well we as an industry have designed that transaction, in my opinion. If somebody does a transaction only once a year, then they won't remember how to do the transaction from last time, and then they also are always very concerned about making mistakes with those transactions, especially if that transaction is important to themselves. So let's take an example like perhaps sending some money to your son who lives on the other side of the world and is at university somewhere, and you want to send that money to his bank account, something that perhaps you do only once a year, say, then you want to make sure that that works perfectly. And in that situation, what you want is what I'm calling here assisted self-service. In other words, that somebody will help him through that transaction. However simple that transaction might be, what you want is good customer service from your bank. You want the bank to hold your hand. You want the bank to be with you as you do that transaction. And you want somebody to say, yeah, that's good, that's exactly right. You did actually transfer the money to the United States like you intended to, and yes, you did actually enter the right country code or whatever it is that you needed to do, and that comfort and confidence that it was done correctly. And from that perspective, ATMs are in a brilliant place to be able to provide these assisted self-service transactions because, of course, you do not want to carry the cost of having a human right next to the customer at where the ATM is. What you want is to be able to do that through a remote assisted self-service concept where the person that is assisting the customer would be in a remote location at a call center. And of course, not only is that a lower cost scenario from a bank's perspective, but it also means that you can have an expert to help with that transaction. So if it is a international transfer of a significant amount of money. Perhaps it's a an amount transfer that is perhaps over 10,000 US dollars, and of course then there are anti-money laundering requirements that come in as well, and you might really want that to be assisted by somebody who is particularly trained to be able to help with those transactions. So the advantage with assisted self-service is A, of course, good customer service, B, the ability for a customer to help himself to do a transaction that he might not want to do by himself at a machine, and C, the ability to bring a true expertise into helping with that transaction. So as I say in that final point there, when somebody helps you through a transaction and it's somebody who is expert and somebody who has seen those transactions being done before, somebody who can give you comfort that that transaction has been executed correctly, then of course what might be seen as difficult by a customer becomes very easy. So here what I'm saying is the combination of lower TCO for self-service hardware, self-service software, and self-service the service proposition, lower TCO, more transaction types, and then the ability to remotely assist with those transaction types. I think these three are the big ingredients, the three big things that as we go into the future will become very powerful indeed, and allows financial inclusion and allows transaction types to be available globally to lots of people worldwide. Now let's look at ATM innovation a little bit more closely about some of the things coming down the pipeline. Obviously, omnichannel is a big buzzword at the moment, and of course makes great sense that channels are not segregated and people don't see channels as separate silos, and that one channel knows what the other channel is doing. Obviously, is what a customer would expect. A customer would expect that when he transacts in one channel and then transacts in another channel, that all of that is an end-to-end single seamless experience for the customer. So being able to pre-stage a transaction on any channel, being able to fulfill those transactions on an ATM, integration, of course, of mobile phones and ATMs. Well, you know, as you know, all of this is big. All the banks are focused on doing something along these lines, and of course we will see significant omnichannel capability, I think, in the coming decade. Of course, I add a couple of things here in terms of omnichannel. Transaction personalization, of course, is very important there, and by that I mean the ability for the customer to have a personalized experience across this omnichannel experience, because of course what you do not want is a vanilla flavor transaction capability where everybody is treated identically, because of course people do want themselves to be treated as an individual, and they want the bank to know what it is that is important for them, and they want the bank to remember what they did in the last 3 transactions, and they want that to be customized correctly, keeping in mind the current context. And of course here the final point here, which is also related to that personalization point, which is that the customer wants to be recognized as a customer and not as just an account. In other words, it is not sufficient that the personalization is account by account based. If the customer has 10 accounts, then the customer wants to be recognized as a whole customer with 10 accounts, and that he can transact with any account using any card, to be able to transact with any account that the customer has at the bank, not just one account at a time and one card at a time. Looking a little bit more at the technology coming down the road, well, of course, you know that the global industry is very focused in moving from XP to Windows 7. And of course, as you know, this Windows 7 migration has been very, very late indeed. Really, we should be going to Windows 8 and Windows 10 now, but the conversation is still at such an early stage, which is really quite crazy. Perhaps some of you know that the ATM IEA Global Committee has had a committee running, in fact 3 committees running, looking at what it is that the ATM industry should do in the future, that the year 2020 does not become another debacle like year 2014, when Windows 7 comes to an end. And unfortunately, this conversation is still not completed. There still has been a big problem in getting commitment from some of the hardware vendors in terms of the direction in which they are willing to go. Next week there is an ATMIA webinar. It might be a little bit early, it might be a little bit late for you guys in Australia, but hopefully you will be able to join that next week. A webinar in which the ATMIA will be running along with Microsoft about the roadmap to Windows 10. The ATMIA committee is getting ready to recommend that Windows 10 is the next stop for ATMs, that perhaps Windows 8.1 might well just be leapfrogged and be ignored, and that banks should go either directly to Windows 10 from XP if they haven't yet gone from XP. As you know, there are still a whole bunch of ATMs that are still on XP. Or, of course, hopefully most of the Australian banks, I believe, have gone to Windows 7, that you'd come up with plans to move to Windows 10. So that webinar is next week, and if you need details, Jeff and hopefully Mangala have some of the details of when that is going to be. Now, some of you will know that NCR announced an Android operating system, and they also said that it could run in a thin client mode. Well, that might be something that will be thrown into the mix in terms of where that ATM industry might go to. My personal view is that it's a little bit of a distraction, and that the ATM industry is going to go to is going to stay pretty much 99% Windows industry. But we shall see, and no doubt NCR will contribute to the committee in the coming weeks. A little bit more about great hardware coming down the line. As you guys know, of course, there is outstanding cash recycling hardware. Much of that comes from Japan. The Japanese ATM vendors have been outstanding at building cash recycling capability. The Oki and Hitachi lead that industry, Fujitsu as well. And many of the Western manufacturers work with the Japanese vendors in order to buy modules and integrate it into Western ATMs as well. Coin recycling, again, significant capability. Very strong companies like Glory, ScanCoin, Cummins Allison that have coin capability. Significant success with check acceptance in the United States, as you know. Check 21 is integrated into large numbers of ATMs in the US, and of course that reduces the cost of check deposit for banks and customers alike. Scanners for barcodes, QR codes, ID cards, all of these very, very interesting in terms of assisted transactions, in terms of wider transaction sets, in terms of pre-stage transactions that you might start in one channel and complete in another channel. And then, of course, ID card recognition is crucial in terms of KYC compliance for customers and the ability to recruit new customers at a point of presence. Some of you will have heard of the KAL's RTM, which is a low-cost ATM that runs at 10% of the TCO of a normal ATM, and it is able to do all of the transactions an ATM can do, as well as video conferencing and assisted teller transactions. It can dispense cash as well as deposit cash, and then we're delighted to be able to tell you that the KAL RTM achieved APCA approval at Christmas time last year. Contactless cards, well, this is of course one of the things that is being integrated into ATMs. KAL today does contactless withdrawal in China with the PBOC Chinese EMV kernel that is required in China. We also do that in Russia with MasterCard. And I'm aware that there is significant interest in Australia as well in doing contactless transactions at the ATM. But of course, a PIN is still required, so it is not quite as sexy as doing a POS transaction and paying for a coffee with just a single tap. But still, the transaction can be much quicker with contactless, of course. And there is, of course, a debate about whether it is safer or not from a skimming point of view, because, of course, theoretically, of course, if the card is contactless, then you can't skim it in the usual way. But, of course, as you probably know, there is a different risk with contactless cards in that it is possible with a strong wireless reader to be able to read some of the contactless data from somebody's pocket directly. So it is a little bit of a mixed blessing in terms of security. It is actually rather disappointing that the contactless specification wasn't implemented well enough to make it just a no-brainer in terms of security. It really should have happened. In terms of contactless EMV kernels, we have a slightly unhelpful situation in that Visa and MasterCard have two different specs for off-us EMV kernels. So that's a little bit unhelpful, but it means that vendors like KAL would have to implement two slightly different EMV kernels. Looking forward to 2017, it's going to be exciting that there'll be EMV everywhere perhaps. Of course, there will be some stragglers, and not all banks would have converted by 2017, but as you probably know, the US should have converted wholly to 2017 based on the mandates they have there. China should be all EMV as well, of course. Japan should be all EMV. Even India is required to be EMV in 2017. Of course, not so likely that all these big countries will be fully EMV. But the thing is, of course, as more and more ATMs and more POS machines become EMV compliant, then as we know, the risk will migrate to the ATMs that are not EMV compliant. So the pressure on all of those banks that are not EMV compliant will definitely rise, because fraud will migrate to those machines. So I think there's a pretty good chance that fairly soon after 2017, there will be a rush to complete EMV, and that the world will finally be fully EMV, and the fraud levels should plummet from that point onwards. There are lots of nice security things coming down the line in terms of security for ATMs, things like BitLocker, of course, with Windows 7 Secure Boot, and UEFI BIOSes and TPMs. And I think ATMs will be really a lot safer as we go into the future. And, they will always be much safer than mobile phones ever can, because obviously a mobile phone is a customer's device, and the bank obviously has no ability to secure the customer's phone device. And last year in 2014, 97% of the phone malware were on Android phones, and of course banking apps were unfortunately, of course, the most attractive target for hackers. So the competition, if you like, to some extent between ATMs and mobile phones, well, who's going to win that. From a security point of view, it'll be hands down ATMs will be secure. For as long as banks have ATMs, they will remain much more secure, and they can be made much more secure with all of the technology that's available. Mobile phones will always have the Achilles heel that it is, of course, not the bank's device. What is the business case that drives ATMs and self-service? What provides the business case for innovation in self-service? What, at the end of the day, the core transaction that carries the self-service industry is, of course, cash dispensing. It is, of course, the 90% transaction on all ATMs, and it is the thing that pays the cost of the ATM channel. And, of course, once a dispense transaction has paid for the infrastructure and the TCO of that network, then it is possible to layer on added value transactions on top of that, which is, of course, the icing on the cake for the deployers. Let's look a little bit more closely at this cash dispense transaction. How important is cash going to be as we go into the future? Is it still going to be able to carry the self-service industry into the next 20 years and the next 50 years? Is cash going to die? Well, the demand for cash is holding up. we don't need to panic just yet that cash is going to go away. Here are a set of numbers that is actually quite surprising. I still find this quite surprising that this is the case. The left-hand graphic is from the European Central Bank. It shows the amount of cash in circulation in the Eurozone. As you can see, it doubled in the last 10 years. And you can also see that that curve is solidly a straight line. It doesn't even look like it is even thinking about tapering off to the horizontal. And those little spikes that you see at the end of each year is, of course, Christmas time, when people need access to more cash. And as you can see, no sign whatsoever of cash tailing off in the Eurozone. And this is despite the fact that maybe some of you know that the European Commission had an official war on cash, and they were trying very hard to convince people to switch away from cash to cards. And in fact, that official war on cash was discontinued a couple of years ago. The European Commission pretty much admitted defeat, that despite all of their effort, as you can see, cash in circulation is rising rapidly. The US is pretty much doing the same thing. Right-hand side, that's from the Federal Reserve. You can see that pretty much cash in circulation doubled in the last 10 years. And of course, cash is growing even faster in Asia. China and India, of course, cash is growing even faster. So I think the basis, the business case for our self-service industry is still pretty solid. And hopefully, as an industry, we will innovate around that, and we will deliver some of these nice transactions to have, which will be the icing on the cake for customers. And hopefully, we will be able to deliver these transactions to the 7 billion people worldwide.